Thanks. Well, I invited myself, but thanks for having me. I want to talk about something which is, I think it's a very interesting topic, but it's slightly beyond the scope of what I'm typically doing. I'm typically studying how people use statistics and how people reason. And actually, you could say this is also about how people reason, but from a slightly different angle. Two of my co-authors are here. Fiona and Henk are also part of this project, which we are still working on. So it's not, we haven't published anything, it's just something we are currently writing on. And actually, I'm the first name here, but I'm not the one who came up with the idea to talk about this, which is one of my PhD students, Rink Hoekstra, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And she decided at SIPS last year to talk about subjectivity and objectivity. And when the session started, the room was completely empty, which was a bit painful for her because she organized something and thought about it. And at the time it was supposed to start, there was really nobody there. And like 2 minutes later, the room was entirely packed with, I believe, like 30, 40 people, and people sat on the floor. And it was a very, very lively discussion, which is not to put pressure on you, but I think it's an interesting topic. I hope it's an interesting topic. So what am I going to talking? What am I going to talk about? I want to discuss these kind of vague topics of objectivity and subjectivity, which are often used colloquially. Oh, terrible word. And they're also used in connection to quantitative and qualitative science. And I think they're often used wrong or sloppily. And I think we should do better there. And it's not about the use of this term, but also the underlying idea of what research means and how certain we can be, etc. So what I actually would like is that we would be a little bit less normative and don't consider objective as the ultimate goal and subjective as something bad. I think it's more nuanced than that. So that's the point I'm trying to get across. Some of you may think that is completely obvious, but I get the feeling that it's not always. So this is not new. I'm not pretending to say anything that hasn't been said before. I want to make that clear. I'm not, sorry, Felipe, but I'm not going to be using a lot of philosophical jargon. I'm trying to keep it simple. Some may say too simple. And I'm going into the debate of talking about quantitative and qualitative methods. But I'm not saying one is better or one is worse. I'm just saying that these are two methods. And I realize, of course, that it's not black and white, and there are mixed methods, and it's maybe gliding scale, whatever. I'm not even going there. But maybe some people think that I'm trying to persuade you to become a qualitative researcher or something, which is not at all what what I want. In fact, I consider myself a statistician, so I'm typically on the quantitative side, but I do think that we have been a bit unfair to qualitative research. So, objectivity and subjectivity, in this paper, we go into definitions, David, what they actually mean, and I could give you like 5 slides with different definitions, and we could discuss which are the best ones. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to do that. I think we all kind of have an idea what we mean by it, and in the end, we will come back to what objectivity is and not is, or what we think it is. Some things that have been said about objectivity, that it's freedom from bias. Well, I think it's part of it, but that's not all of it. Intersubjectivity is a term that is often used. Reliability, that you do it over and over again, you get similar results, independent of people. It's probably all of the above, but well, we'll see about that. But either way, subjectivity has, I think, a bad reputation in science. If we teach people what science is and how to distinguish science from non-science, one of the first things people think of is objectivity. So I did this with my third year students when I teach a course on philosophy of science. And we have this, I don't remember the program, but you can ask people to type in words on their cell phones, and then there is this word cloud on the screen. And we've done it a couple of years, and objectivity is always one of the key terms that people mention if we ask, like, what is science? So apparently objectivity is related to science, and in contrast, subjectivity is considered worse or negative. Some have even argued that subjectivity, well, we should stay away from that as much as possible. And I understand where that's coming from, because, yeah, we don't want too many biases in our research. We won't want typically, sometimes we do, but emotions to affect what we conclude. But I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think we should always consider objectivity the ultimate goal. I do think individual differences and biases are sometimes inevitable, and rather than pretending that we are all objective, we should just try to talk about these differences, talk about our biases, talk about where we come from. And, well, to some of you that may seem pretty obvious, but I think there is if I talk to people one-to-one, most people, I think, agree with that. But then in the end, if we look at papers, we don't see that at all. We don't talk about these things too much. We give pretty strong conclusions. This is actually also work that I've been doing now for quite a while. We oversell our conclusions. We pretend like we give an ultimate answer to a question that was asked. And I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that's bad. I mean, that's not what science is for. We take tiny steps, and I'm not even sure where to, but slowly we learn. But it's not that a study gives the answer. I'm a bit skeptical. So let's talk about statistics a little. It's a bit of a sidestep, but I do think it's related, and especially how we teach our student what statistics is doing. Well, I think statistics often has the pretense of giving objective answers to research questions. That's how statistics is often used. And typically, more often than not, we don't acknowledge that in order to get there, many choices have been made. Of course, we have a method section, we describe how we got there, but in the conclusion section, when we talk about statistics, I don't think this is given a lot of thought and a lot of attention. Like how did we get there? It's like we have this significant p-value, but it is based on many assumptions and many choices until we got there, and that could have been something completely different, which is fine. I'm not criticizing that. I'm criticizing the fact that we don't talk about it. What we also tend to do with statistics is kind of ignoring uncertainty. In my maybe naive idea of statistics, we want to quantify the amount of uncertainty that's out there, whereas typically I think people use statistics to kind of get rid of uncertainty and say, hey, it's significant, therefore this is true. And of course, if you ask them, they realize, of course, there's uncertainty, but this is not how we describe our results. Again, it's all my opinion, or our opinion maybe, from the authors, but so if you disagree, there will be time for discussion. And I think what we generally do is overgeneralize results. We pretend like all these choices haven't been made. This is the answer to a general question. Whereas I would say it's a very specific operationalization with many choices, and eventually we give a tiny answer, but you could have given different answers if you would have done it differently. So this is a quote. I don't like reading quotes for an audience. If you don't like reading quotes, you have to take and do something else for 30 seconds. But otherwise, please read. It's a bit archaic, but maybe you get the gist of it. And my main point is basically this last sentence. Like it or not, empirical science is necessarily a subjective business. We don't talk about it like that, but it is, and I think we should talk about it. So I haven't talked too much about qualitative research, but they are kind of different. And what they do is actually embrace subjectivity. They talk about where they're coming from as authors, and they talk about subjective choices that they make. They also justify them. So you may not agree with it, but this is their conclusion, and they try to justify how they got to these conclusions. And it's very common in qualitative research to give positionality statements, to say like, hey, I'm sorry, that was not. Yeah. This is where I'm coming from. I'm a Caucasian male, middle-aged, whatever. And this is, I would say that may not even be the most interesting thing to say. You could also say what your department is doing, what the typical types of research are, or how you've been trained, whatever. There are many things you can say that may or may not be relevant to interpreting your subjective evaluation of the data. And in quantitative science, we don't see this at all. Of course, you could look up who someone is, or you might know this person, but typically we don't talk about them. And I often get the question, and I've talked to some of you and also other people, like, how do we perceive qualitative science? And I often get the impression, especially within the social sciences, that we kind of look down on qualitative science. You may not say so, but even some people say so. Like yeah, it's kind of inferior type of research. And well, I disagree. I don't think it is. I think it's just a different way of going about answering research questions. And I actually think eventually the two will meet each other. And well, it's not a very prominent discussion now, but similar criticism has been given to subjective Bayesian methods, which you may or may not be aware of, but there are different strands of Bayesian statistics, and some explicitly quantify your subjective opinions, whereas others do not. And in the old days, at least like 20 years ago or something, one of the main criticisms that I've read about Bayesian statistics is that we shouldn't do it because it's subjective. You may have other reasons not to like Bayesian statistics, but I always find that a bit of a weird argument. Like, we shouldn't do it because it's subjective. Well, why? So, and the flip side is, so what the point I'm trying to make is qualitative research actually says, okay, we are subjective. And quantitative research is often contrasted. It's like we are objective, these qualitative people are subjective. And I think that's a simplification. And I hope we all agree on that. Quantitative methods may not be as objective as they seem. So you could say, well, if we have this questionnaire and we try to score how many questions someone has to write or what this person's score is, we will end up in the same outcome. And I would have to admit, yes, sure. If that's what you call objective, then it may be objective. But I think, first of all, this is not always the case. This is a kind of a simplistic way of looking at analyzing data. And second of all, even if it were the case that we come all to the same number in the end, which is not, but even if it were the case, then that doesn't necessarily make it valid or interesting. We've all done tests where a number pops out and you realize immediately, like, this number doesn't reflect me. This is not a good reflection of what I've been doing. So I think that quantitative methods may not be as objective as they seem. And now I'm going to make bit of a controversial claim, I think, and I think I see the arguments against it. If outcomes would be objective, I think there's two things we might expect. And again, there are arguments against it. But I think that eventually different people studying the same phenomenon would eventually come to some kind of an agreement, would have converging results. And the controversial thing is that I think in practice, we often see that this is not the case. And of course, you can say, well, if we have publication bias, we have QRPs, whatever. So there are many biases in the system, but in an ideal science, this is what would happen. I don't know, maybe. I'm not sure whether that's the case. And you could also say, well, at a minimum, if we once got to the study, if you have collected the data and you give some people the same results, well, at least they would have to come to the same conclusion, right? Well, first of all, and this is where I'm in doubt a little bit myself as well, but I see a lot of people on their islands defending their particular theories, and I don't see a lot of convergence in psychology. And you could explain that away, maybe because of QRPs, maybe because of the incentive structure. There are many reasons you could give. But I also have the impression that, well, maybe your definitions problem is one of them, that different people just do different things differently. And they may not have the same definitions, and maybe that's not even a bad thing. We should just be explicit about it. And we have, you may well be aware of this, there have been many analyst studies where analysts analyzed the same data set independently, and well, a naive person would think like, okay, they will all come to the same conclusion, but people do not. So here's a couple of papers of people who did that, and well, they all come to the same conclusion, namely that people do not come to the same conclusion, and so that's kind of shocking, because we often pretend like this is our answer, and this is the only answer that could have been given this data set, and that's just not the case. So we shouldn't pretend. That's my point, actually. So, but you can say, well, wait a second. If there's like 10 analysts analyzing a data set, 9 did it wrong, 1 did it right. I think that's a hard point to defend, but it could be the case, right? It could be that people just make mistakes, but eventually there's one correct analysis. I doubt it, but that could be your opinion, and that could counter the point I was making. So that's one possible answer, like they're wrong, 1 does it right, and objective, something. Or there are simply multiple ways to answer the same question within the same data set. And that, to me, seems a more obvious answer to this problem. And again, this has been said over and over again. And so I'm not saying that this is new. What I'm saying is that we don't talk about it enough. So you may have heard of the Garden of 14 Paths, or researchers' degree to freedom. You can make many choices, and eventually you end up something. And what I like about this metaphor, especially if you have these kind of roads, splits, how do you call it, splittings? That if you walk into the woods and you can go either left or right, and you have many of those, then, well, it's obvious if you start that you have multiple options. But if you're out of the woods in the end and you walk back, there's only one way back, right? So it may seem to you like this was the only way looking back. And this is often how we present it. We kind of ignore all these paths that we could have chosen, because if you look back, this seems like the only way. I don't think it was meant like this, but I like this part of it, this metaphor. And it's all coming down to the same point, like we are making choices all the time. There may or may not be subjective, but it's not always obvious what choice we have to make. Which is fine, but we should acknowledge it. Multiverse idea, which you may all be familiar with, or many of you may know, is basically the same idea. The same data set could have been analyzed in many different ways. And the idea of the multiverse is that we could actually do that. We could look at different operationalizations, for example, and see how that turns out different. So in the entire process, there are many choices made. And I think at some point they are subjective. They are based on personal preference or whatever. And again, that's fine. Well, some points where we make these choices. First of all, what we study in the first place. We could have studied something differently, and we may have our biases, what we study and what we don't. This is a very important one. How do we operationalize our variables? Let's say you're in depression research. How do you operationalize depression? You could do that in hundreds of ways. It is kind of weird to say, okay, here's this questionnaire, and that is the depressing question. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, you could measure depression by doing a questionnaire. I'm not doubting that. But saying that that is the way, that feels very, very awkward. So, of course, there are different ways to go about it. And of course, even this questionnaire could have been completely different. And of course, you hope that different people studying the same phenomenon do something more or less the same, and there should be a correlation between what people find and based on different operationalizations, but it shouldn't be the same. Well, instruments, kind of related. Choice of methods, you could have chosen a different method, as we just saw. And also how you frame or phrase your conclusions. That could have been also different. It's not that there's no degrees of freedom there. You can, even if you end up with a certain statistical result, it's not fixed what you can and cannot say. Luckily, I think that's a good thing, that we can talk about it, speculate, interpret. That is our task. I think we have a subjective duty almost to interpret the results for the reader. Although many people find it very hard. Many people rely on, I think that's one of the reasons why, for example, significance testing is so popular, rely on, okay, the test says X, and therefore that's what I need to study. And of course, the test says something, I'm not denying that, but what you can conclude and what it entails and how important it is, that's all subjective. Even if we haven't considered biases, which we definitely all have. So you could say, okay, well, why is this a problem? I agree with you, but why is this a problem in the first place? Well, first of all, I think the simplistic notion of objective is good, subjective is bad, is unfair to people doing qualitative research. And they can speak for themselves, but I do think that it's kind of unfair. And it also kind of portrays quantitative research as we are the real science, we are objective, and I just don't think that's true. I'm not against subjective. I'm not buying into this entire perspective that it's good to be objective, but we shouldn't pretend that we are. So I think also we, or let's we as in I, quantitative research, we are just giving a possible answer, and it's justified, and we try to justify it as good as possible, but we could have given another answer. And let's just acknowledge that this may not be as easy to write up, because it's much easier to say, hey, this is what we found and we now know X, but that's just not, it's not how we're supposed to write about our result. I think we should acknowledge uncertainty and acknowledge our limitation and embrace them and also put them in the conclusion section. Basically, it's another way of making our humility a claim. We should be humble about our results. I think it's very important. Now, what could you say? I'm already defensive about possible objections. You could say, well, but we do talk about it. They are in the method. I'm giving you my questionnaire. You can judge it. So it's up to you to criticize that. And to some extent, that is true. The same holds for limitation sections. Many people say, like you criticize my work, but let's talk about it. Look at this limitation section. And as some of you may know, I'm not too impressed with that argument, because limitation section often is also a way to put things away rather than make them feasible. I think many people use it almost as a rhetorical trick to say, hey, don't criticize me. I know about that. And that is, I don't think that's how science should work. I think we should actually talk about these issues. And that entails that we should talk about them in the conclusion section where it's actually important. And you can say, well, but it takes many words and we should be concise in our writing. Sure, but I think this is important enough to actually write about it. And it may not be easy. Maybe I don't find it easy. It's probably easy for you to pick paper of mine and say, hey, you didn't do it yourself, so why criticize the rest? I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's something worth striving for. And I do want to point out that the conclusion, whether we like it or not, but the conclusion section is what people actually read. Maybe the abstract and then the conclusion. Mm-hmm. So if the conclusions don't include a reflection on how they came about, then subjectivity that is there is basically invisible. And you can say, well, you should just read the entire paper. Yeah, but we can't read all these papers about the topics we're interested in. I can't, and I think many others can. So basically, all this subjectivity is typically swept under the rug, and I think we should move away that rug. So I'm almost at the end of my talk. I already said that I want to give a short talk because I want to have some room for discussion, and I think we have 10, 15 minutes for discussion. Yeah. So that's a good thing. I hope it will be as lively. You've been awfully silent, but I hope that's a good thing. But I would like to give the floor to you now. I have a couple of statements, and I'm a little bit in doubt whether we should do them one by one or. But maybe the first one is kind of a general question. Then I come to some more controversial statements. Like one possible explanation for your silence could be that, like, we know about this all along, and this is such an old message. What are you even talking about? Or can you relate to it to some extent? Can you relate to the fact that sometimes qualitative research is in the social sciences considered somewhat inferior, and should we actually talk about it? So basically, I want an assessment like, is this important enough to discuss? Is there anyone who would like to say something?